Since mid-2000, the question we're going to deal with, Barry and I, will be on whether China practices colonialism in Africa. Of course, our answer is no. Since mid-2000s, Western politicians and media have alleged China practices neo-colonialism in Africa. Their claims play on misunderstandings or reductionist understandings of modern colonialism, such as that colonialism can be reduced to one transnational imbalance. For example, colonialism is present where one country trades its manufactured goods for another country's primary products. A colonialist label is attached to China in order to displace criticisms of Western powers, both of their colonial legacies and of current neoliberal policies that Western entities impose on Africa. This label reflects not the reality, but Western elites' perception that they face a global struggle with a formidable competitor, China. While the colonialist label has no basis, Chinese companies in Africa still may behave much like those from other countries, reproducing some of the problems of the current global system. It is worth noting that Western political elites mainly talk positively about their own history of colonialism. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was such a defender. In 1988, she stated, "The story of how Europeans explored and colonized, and yes, without apology, civilized much of the world, is an extraordinary tale of talent, skill, and courage." Tony Blair of the Labour Party had a similar view. In 1997, he stated, "There's a lot of rubbish talked about the empire. In my view, we should not either be apologizing for it or wringing our hands about it. It was in many ways a most extraordinary achievement." France's parliament passed a law in 2005 that demanded that schools teach that French colonialism was beneficial, especially in North Africa. US President, going back. US President George Bush Jr. had one time also, Barry, it's the wrong page.
No, it's the next page.
Okay. Okay, give me the next page. Claims that colonialism civilized the natives included persistent conservative justification of slavery as needed to transform savage Africans. They accord with the common white man's burden assumption that subjugated peoples were backward and incapable of creating industry, good governance, and a culture that serves their own good. For example, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has stated that British planted coffee, cotton, tobacco in Uganda, but if left to their own devices, the natives would have relied on nothing but bananas. US President George W. Bush in 2000s positively analogized the US conquest of Iraq to US colonization of the Philippines. And some US writers in 2000s also said the US should colonize parts of the developing world, especially in Africa and the Middle East. One such example is the liberal US journalist William Pfaff, who argued in the leading journal Foreign Affairs that because there's a lack of civil society in much of Africa, therefore Africa, he argued, one could call for a disinterested neocolonialism. Since late 1980s, across the political spectrum in the US, there has been a moral condemnation of the global South, and it is linked to vindication of colonialism to boost the moral credibility of the West. Most definitions, so from here on, I'm going to discuss characteristics of modern colonialism to set up a comparative framework. So in the second part, Barry can discuss Chinese practices in Africa. Most definitions of colonialism capture only one aspect of what is distinctive about it. And many definitions confuse colonialism with empire, dependency, or settlement, with transnational political influence, or with disadvantageous trade and investment. And based on our own study of the cases, colonialism involved a degree of control of economic and political development that is inconceivable in informal independencies. It included a complete loss of sovereignty and often almost total exclusion from power of local elites. So our definition is that colonialism is a relationship in which alien Western and Japanese rulers in subdued overseas lands practiced exclusionary authoritarian rule, imposed explicit racial hierarchy, enriched metropolitan and colonizing elites by monopoly exploitation of the colony's natural resources, labor, and trade, and depleted, impoverished their native populations, while often extirpating the cultures of the most vulnerable colonized peoples. The Polish-British writer Joseph Conrad, in his 1899 novel, The Heart of Darkness, called the ongoing final colonization of Africa the vilest scramble for loot that ever disfigured the history of human conscience. In 1770, the so-called economic backwardness was found among only 10% of the world's population. 90% were on a roughly equal plane of development. Colonial mode exploitation, however, demanded that colonies could only import products from the colonizing metropoles and had to maintain very low or no tariffs. Colonial exports could only be made to metropoles from where they were often re-exported. Production of manufactured goods in the colonies that could compete with metropole products was banned. Transport between colonies and metropoles were only on metropole ships. Such conditions, according to French historian Paul Béroche and Guyanese historian Walter Rodney, led to a lack of diffusion of industrial revolution to the colonies or Africa's deindustrialization. Modern colonialism and the slavery related to it produced demographic catastrophes in the colonized world, which also contributed to colonized people's de-development. So, but colonizing countries actually gained demographic reward of colonialism. So wealth from slave trade and colonies limited colonizing countries' immigration and
looks like your connection has dropped. Can proceed, maybe, Barry?
Yeah, I'll do that. So colonized countries gained demographic rewards from colonialism. Wealth from the slave trade and colonies limited colonizing countries' immigration and reduced their mortality rates. The principal colonies were supposed to provide monopoly profits for the colonialists. A 19th century French official in Algeria said that a colony's utility equals the total of profits and advantages that the metropole accrues. Unprofitable colonies were usually abandoned. The British Empire had 80% of colonized peoples, and during most of the colonial era was hugely profitable. Costs of colonialism were socialized, but profits went to bankers, traders, colonizers, and usually the state. According to Leo Goodstad, a leading historian of Hong Kong, the imperial tradition required colonial territories to invest their reserves in British and Commonwealth securities, to embrace the sterling area's exchange controls, to procure supplies through crown agents in London, and to use commercial and technical standards from Britain. Until the 1970s, these imperial conventions served to direct business toward the United Kingdom and to restrict market opportunities for the rest of the world. Defense arrangements too appeared to provide Hong Kong with a British garrison at an unnecessarily high price. In Africa, native entrepreneurs were so restricted that they disappeared. Existing trade was destroyed in order to divert attention to producing export crops for European industries and importing European manufactures. The growth of Africa's urban population stagnated at 10% in the colonial period, despite an influx of urban non-Africans, while the world's urban population grew from 9% in 1600 to 20% in 1900. Colonial rulers typically limited the amount and kind of investment by others. They curbed or banned native industries that competed with those of the metropole. They seized land and gave it to settlers. They redistributed the rural population and forced it to grow cash crops to better extract high and regressive taxes to finance their administration. Natives in modern colonies have been politically subordinate to colonizers. Discrimination was exceptionally harsh in Africa, but systematic even in such colonies as Hong Kong and the US's possessions. Power resided with the governor and his expatriate lieutenants in Hong Kong, for example. Top bureaucrats were from the metropole. In Hong Kong, the British governor appointed all members of governing institutions from 1842 until indirect elections were staged in 1985, and almost no Chinese served in government until after World War II. In Hong Kong, British judges punished Chinese defendants much more severely than Western defendants. In many colonies, communication with the government had to be in the colonial language. In Macau, for example, legal documents were only in Portuguese, the language of 2% of residents. The imported church was privileged. The Catholic Church in Macau represented 6% of the population, but was in charge of schooling the natives. Few colonized people were accorded citizenship. No colonies in their heyday gave natives rights equal to those of the colonialists. According to Osterhammel, a famous scholar of colonialism, the split of colonial law into one set of laws for foreigners and another for natives sometimes led to a blatant double standard of justice according to race, especially in settler colonies such as Algeria, where there was an especially harsh and demeaning code indigène for the Algerians. A double standard of justice was also found in exploitation colonies such as Japanese Taiwan. In Africa, the medical establishment was almost exclusively for the benefit of the European population. In Britain's colony of Sierra Leone, 3% of children attended school. The percentage was even lower in such British colonies as Gambia and northern Nigeria. Inequality was everywhere in the colonies. Resistance to colonialism was met with ferocious extra-legal repression. More than 100,000 Kikuyu in Kenya died, many by hangings and torture in concentration camps where Britain fought anti-colonial rebels from 1952 to 1960. As many as 1 million Algerians were killed from 1954 to 1962 when the French colonialists attempted to keep Algeria French. As Jonathan Krieghaus, a development analyst, has put it, by far the best colonial legacy was not to be colonized at all. Countries that avoided European colonization, as in select parts of Asia, frequently enjoyed highly efficacious states and societies, resulting in rapid economic growth. Indeed, colonialism was a catastrophe for the colonized. The same, however, cannot be said about China's practices in Africa, which I will now turn to. Mainstream Western politicians and media, especially in the US and UK, claim China practices neocolonialism in Africa. The US, however, largely backed colonialism from the 1950s to 1970s and supported the white racist regime in South Africa until the late 1980s. China opposed colonialism, training African anti-colonial fighters. To be a colonial power, China would have to practice a colonial mode of accumulation. It would have to force African elites to make decisions that China favors, engage in racial oppression, and enrich China by monopolies of African resources, trade, and labor. But China does not directly or indirectly control any African state. Meanwhile, the US and UK control most of the world's remaining colonies. Western sources often cite the same cases of so-called Chinese control in Africa, Sudan and Zimbabwe, These are two states, by the way, where we've done field work. Sudan is not dependent on China for sustaining the regime or for waging war. It is Sudanizing its main industry, oil. Oil is, of course, fungible. Sudan sells it on the international market. The China-Sudan relationship involves much less control than the US exercised in 21st century Iraq or Afghanistan. There, the US sponsored security forces, promulgated legal codes, propped up favored political forces, etc. There is no indication that China exercises substantial leverage in Zimbabwe. Its trade with Zimbabwe is less than 1% of its trade with Africa. About 1% of Zimbabwe's exports go to China, and 8.5% of its imports come from China. China's stock of outbound foreign direct investment in Africa, 47 billion US dollars, is 2% of its global OFDI. Its flow of investment to Africa in the first 3 quarters of this year was $2.5 billion. Again, only about 2% of the flow of China's OFDI to the world. China's stock of Zimbabwean investment is about 1 billion US dollars, mainly in developing a new integrated industry, steel. Most foreign investment in Zimbabwe is from South Africa, although Russian investment in Zimbabwean mining alone is over $5 billion. China actually has so little control over Zimbabwe's government that its ambassador had to ask that the Zimbabwe-China investment treaty be respected by not requiring sale of majority ownership in Chinese firms to Zimbabweans. South Africa, in fact, has great leverage in Zimbabwe. It controls its electricity, grain, and oil imports. Now, some individual Chinese, of course, are racist. After all, it's 1.4 billion people. But China can't promote racism as supporters of colonialism do. A Chinese newspaper could never publish anything like what was written by the editor of the Sunday Telegraph, which is the unofficial organ of the UK's Conservative Party. He wrote that Africa will never enjoy the blessings of peace and prosperity and escape the curses of civil war, famine, pestilence, and genocide until the white man once again takes over political control. Chinese neocolonialism in Africa is sometimes framed as Africans selling primary products to China while Chinese sell manufactured goods to Africa. But this unequal trade is not only found in colonial relationships. In the 19th century, the US sold Britain primary products while Britain sold manufactures to the US. The US was not Britain's colony, however. Today, Canada, India, Australia, etc., mainly sell primary products to China, which sells manufactured goods to them. No one thinks these countries are Chinese colonies. Colonialists forced their African and other colonies to only produce primary products and forced them to receive manufactured goods from the colonizing country. China does not exercise such force against any country. Much of what China sells to Africa is industrial equipment that contributes to manufacturing in Africa. Moreover, Carnegie International Economics Program researchers have noted that Chinese and African exports overlap in only few industries, such as clothing and textiles, which suggests limited competition in third markets. For example, the Export Similarity Index, a measure of the extent to which exports overlap, is only 7.3% between Africa, excluding South Africa, and China. Manufacturers account for only 20% of Africa's exports as compared to China's 95%, suggesting that China provides little competition to Africa's exports. Poor infrastructure is, of course, a major factor inhibiting development in Africa. China is the main source of funds for and main builder of infrastructure in Africa, which is, of course, the precursor of the continent's industrialization. Chinese firms build for profit, often in the range of 5 to 10%, but that's much lower than Western firms, which typically expect 25 to 35% profit. For example, in Tanzania, Chinese firms build roads for on average 600,000 US dollars per kilometer. Western firms charge $1 million per kilometer. Chinese building African infrastructure live under conditions not at all comparable to colonialists. They often live under much harsher conditions than most expatriate Westerners have in Africa. Some Chinese in Africa lead lives not very different from most Africans. Chinese are, of course, famous for hard work, including participation at times by managers, engineers, and skilled workers in physical labor, not something colonialists did. Very few of the large plantations in Africa are owned by Chinese. China has a few oil blocks in Africa, and Chinese-owned mines in Africa are far from being the largest or most profitable. Regarding trade, China is sometimes accused of mercantilism. Mercantilism, however, was a 17th to 18th century system that held that there's a finite global volume of trade. The state should promote specific exports by private firm activity. There should be restrictions on specific imports through high tariff barriers, and trade surpluses should be pursued. That was mercantilism. Mercantilist Britain enforced laws to exclude all foreign merchants from many American colonies. It required that manufacturers, slaves, capital, and credit be obtained only from British sources. But China does not seek a trade surplus with Africa. Since the year 2000, China has had $1.2 trillion of imports from Africa and $1.27 trillion in exports to Africa. Annual trade is now about 200 billion US dollars. Imports from and exports to Africa are each some $100 billion. China does not push specific exports to Africa. It does not restrict most imports from Africa, but facilitates many by abolishing or lowering tariffs. The US and the EU, however, subsidize their own farmers and place high tariffs on some agricultural imports from Africa. Mercantilism was a system suited to developing European colonialism, but is not suited to modern economies. It thus has no apparent relation to Chinese practices in Africa. The Chinese government is in fact said to be keen to differentiate its Africa policy from those of the former colonial powers by stressing its hands-off approach. A Chinese diplomat in South Africa has said that non-intervention is our brand, like intervention is the Americans' brand. Another way, of course, is to aid African education, which colonialists hardly did. In 2020-21, China was the largest single provider of university scholarships to students from sub-Saharan Africa. 12,000 of the total of 30,000 bursaries distributed by the top 50 global donors. Almost all Africans who study in China return to Africa. Brain gain from training Africans in China contrasts with African brain drain to the US and Europe, from which only 25 to 45% of African scholarship students return. China has set up vocational education and capacity building centers in Africa to train hundreds of thousands of African technicians. Tens of thousands of African students have had training opportunities in China. China has 1,000 doctors and nurses serving in 45 African countries and training African counterparts at any given time. And of course, it's sending 1,500 more to aid the anti-COVID fight, and it's provided Africa with millions of doses of vaccine and will provide 1 billion more in 2022. A Nigerian scholar has observed that China's emergence as a major economic power in the 1990s, despite not being a democracy or adopting economic policies typically recommended by the international financial institutions, has become a source of great interest for both Africa's rulers and ruled. The China as colonialism discourse intends to mitigate such interests. It seeks to blunt the strategic competition Western elites think they have with China in Africa. Western elites seek through this discourse to, first of all, demonstrate the superiority of liberal political systems. They also want to present Western influence as necessary to African advancement, to occlude the history of colonial offenses against colonized people, to vindicate Western neoliberal opposition to so-called state-centered development, and to boost nationalism in the historically colonizing countries while facilitating their future competition with China. Westerners who identify with colonialism or want to redeem it by claiming it had good aspects are trying to transfer the stigma of colonial oppression to Chinese. To argue China is not engaged in African colonialism is, of course, not to say that no Chinese exploit or oppress Africans. China is partly linked to the post-colonial capitalism in Africa that derives from the gross inequality and power asymmetry that was first created by colonialism. China, as a trade-driven industrial power, is integrated into a world system that's fixed on national wealth and power. China thus impacts Africa through its semi-neoliberalism. It partly replicates the developed states' policies in Africa of disadvantageous terms of trade, exploitation of natural resources, oppressive labor regimes, and support for malign rulers. It is not likely, however, that China will become a colonial power in the future. Colonialism is unpopular, except among Western elites and a few elite people in ex-colonies. China's government can still decide to act differently from Western states in important regards. For example, unlike Western governments, it can still command its SOEs and influence private firms to not have Western companies' profit maximization standards, thus staying away from one of the major drivers of colonialism. Thanks very much.